thank you all very much for coming. I feel a weight upon me with the obligation of introducing Leslie Griffiths, the Reverend Dr. Leslie Griffiths, or Lord Griffiths of Bury Port. Leslie shouldn't really need any introduction to Lampeter because he was a lecturer in Lampeter in the 1960s, subsequently went to Cambridge, became a Methodist minister, a missionary minister in Haiti, latterly a minister at Wesley's Chapel in London, and of course a member of the House of Lords and a front bench spokesman for some of that time, I think. But none of that really relates to what he's talking to us today about, other than his perhaps as a Methodist minister. He's talking today about, as he described him, as sort of somebody who burnt a sort of bright and short, really, in his life, Hugh Hughes, an important Welsh figure in Methodism. And so I'm going to hand the floor over to Leslie.
Thank you, Bill. Well, it's first of all very nice to be sitting here. I remember when the library was opened, the Duke of Edinburgh helicoptered in, did the necessary, and helicoptered out again. And when I came to teach here, it was the first time that women had been admitted, and that posed all kinds of very interesting dimensions to the way we organize things. So it's nice to be back. 3 years, unforgettable. Let me just set what I want to say in some kind of context. It's a kind of with some mixed feelings. I have to confess a very personal interest in Hugh Hughes. He offered for the Methodist ministry precisely and almost to the day 100 years before I did, and we were the only two Methodist ministers to come from Carmarthen. And when my candidature was accepted by the Methodist Conference and announced in a meeting in Kidwelly, there was a round of applause. The first, said somebody, since Hugh Hughes. Well, it went further than that because Hugh Hughes, as we'll see in a moment, went on to do some rather extraordinary things. And one of them was to be the founder superintendent minister of the West London Mission, which opened in 1887. I only mention that it was and we'll have some of the details later, but because I became the 8th superintendent of the West London Mission. And in my office, over my chair, on the wall behind me, was a portrait of Hugh Hughes. So I could never really get away from him. He was an extraordinary man. Then the second disclaimer is that in the 1990s, I collaborated very closely with an American scholar called Christopher Olston Moore. And he wrote the only real sort of analytical biography of Hugh Hughes that there has been. There was an early biography written by his daughter, but this was done in the 1990s by this American scholar. I checked him out I Googled him to see if he was still alive and what he's doing. He's now lecturing on the history of men's beards in some American university. But he was doing Hugh Hughes then, and for a PhD in the University of Wales. And because of my connection, or the connection I felt I had with Hugh Hughes, I collaborated very closely. I found a lot of source material for him and helped him along the way. And indeed, in the preface, he's very kind in recognizing some of this. So I make no, it's published also by the University of Wales Press. I think that's worth saying. But for all that, I make no excuses for the fact that I do raid Christopher Olston Moore's book a little at times, because I feel that some of it is mine. And can be justified anyway. Those two things as I start. Now, can I just check first of all how many people had heard of Hugh Hughes? About 4 or 5, and the rest hadn't. Well, there you are. Well, then it's a bright, clean slate that I paint my picture on. Hugh Hughes, right? A story, I've called it a story of Christian audacity. Hugh Price Hughes was born in Carmarthen, a sleepy market town in southwest Wales. His father was a medical doctor, and his grandfather, Hugh Hughes, is widely acknowledged as a Welsh language pioneer of the Wesleyan Methodist revival in Wales. At the age of 13, Hugh Price Hughes underwent a profound conversion experience in the presence of a group of Cornish fishermen pulled up at Mumbles, where Hughes was at school, and he never wavered in his faith from that time on. Still, in his teens, he was accepted for the ministry and underwent his training at Richmond College. His days in Wales had already finished. In the days before non-Anglicans were admitted to Oxford or Cambridge, he gained a BA and later added an MA from London University. And Brixton, and there are 10, and I'm telling none of them. I just mention it. He developed in a highly unusual way a very high approach to leading worship, which offered a blend of thoughtful preaching. I'm quoting Olston Moore, but it might be me, remember that. A carefully crafted liturgy, intentional revivalism, effective organization, and successful building projects. At the same time, from his earliest years, he took a keen interest in public issues and was always ready to campaign for causes dear to his heart, and much of that will be revealed in a moment or two. The changes he brought to the way Methodism was organized were stupendous. Since the death of John Wesley, there had been a struggle between those who wanted to perpetuate the autocratic leadership style of its founder, because Wesley was certainly that. They'd meet his preachers to see who amongst the preachers would be stationed where. And after 2.5 hours of intense conversations, he'd pull a list out of his back pocket and say, this is what I came with, and that's what they did. So what the discussion was about, heaven only knows. There were others who wanted something altogether more adventurous and open-minded. The struggle had culminated in the bitter disputes in the late 1840s known as the Fly Sheets controversy, which saw Methodism lose over 100,000, 1/3 of its members. It didn't take Hughes long to see that the demise of the church and the divisions within the church presented an opportunity to campaign for major reforms. The adjective used most frequently to describe him is audacious. A campaign which Hughes mounted with great energy sought to make Methodism organizationally fit for purpose, able, in the words of Charles Wesley, to serve the present age. As wider swathes of the population became entitled to vote, so Hughes campaigned for greater democracy in the constitution of the annual Methodist Conference. He supported the right of lay people, men first, and women some years later, to be members of the conference. He sought to end the 3-year appointments for ministers. He'd already endured, as I've listed, 6 of these, and considered such a rule ineffectual to deal with the changes of the times. He fought for greater flexibility so that the church could more effectively minister, especially in the cities and the towns, whose populations were increasing speedily as the Industrial Revolution unfolded. This was the age which saw the founding of city missions, which began in East London and Manchester in 1885, West London Mission, which was superintended by Hughes, 1887, a position which he continued to hold, the West London Mission, until his death, from 1885 until 1902. Much of the energy for these changes arose from the ferment of ideas and proposals being put forward during Hughes's time in Brixton. In the last of his 3-year appointments there in 1884 to 1887. Even at this distance of time, it all seems breathtaking. Some of the great men of Methodism had their membership in the church on Brixton Hill, men educated in Oxford and Cambridge. You have to put that forward, because it's only in 1873 that Methodists were allowed to study at Oxford and Cambridge, but there they were at Brixton Hill. A former Lord Mayor of London, leaders in the business world, and so many other educated and formed people. They had all become aware of the backwardness of Methodism, its adherence to governance models that had been formed in the wake of the French Revolution, but had lost touch with the surging of democratic forces across the world, across the land. Hughes was happy to embrace socialism long before the foundation of the Labour Party. And if you've ever wondered where the phrase that Labour owes more to Methodism than to Marx, you'll find it pretty closely tied up with Hugh Price Hughes. And he needed both the pulpit and a vehicle of communication that could arm him for the tasks ahead of him. The pulpit first. The West London Mission, which would, it was the West London Mission that would meet this need for the rest of his life. With great fanfare and in a blaze of publicity, the mission was opened in October 1887 with services in Exeter Hall. There was no fixed abode in those days. They rented huge halls in West London, and the congregations numbered thousands. Hughes was the man of the moment. He'd succeeded in getting a colleague, Mark Guy Pearce. I have to say, when I started this task, I'd agreed with Bill. I knew the story rather intimately, or at least I thought I did, and found that I'd got sort of into it before I realized I was really, really bored with it. Because there was a predictability about it. And I don't like the linear way of putting a paper like this out anyway. You know, when he did this, he did that. And after that, well, he did this. And along the way, I keep on finding little nuggets even now, because I scrapped it, threw it away, and started again. But the mention of Mark Guy Pearce, a Cornishman, widely respected, a beloved minister renowned for his artistic gifts and for his measured and spiritual sermons, as different in style and substance from Hughes's as could be imagined. And I wanted at a tangent to go off and explore a little of Mark Guy Pearce. I withheld. I made a list of the next places to go when I've delivered myself of this particular talk. And believe you me, some of them are interesting. And he all over the country. He was, well, let me not get dragged into it now. Anyway, Hughes instructed Pearce to preach to the saints at the morning services, to leave the sinners to him in the evening meetings. Everything went swimmingly well. They had brass bands, they had special sections for nurses and members of the armed forces, and it was just extraordinary. It should be said, however, that these developments were not welcomed by all. They generated and fed a disgruntled conservative group who deeply resented the changes Hughes had brought about. The vehicle created by Hughes to communicate his message was a newspaper which he called the Methodist Times. The genesis of that initiative came about with the preparative work being done by Hughes and his backers in setting up the West London Mission. They knew they'd need something to do the communication work. The urgency to get the mission up and running came from a study undertaken by Andrew Mearns, a Congregationalist, entitled The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, which was published by the Pall Mall Gazette in 1883. It had caused a great stir in public and political circles, and W.T. Stead, now here's another person I wanted to go after with all my might, I can tell you, who was the editor of the Gazette. He pulled no punches in his efforts to bring the condition of those living in London's slums to the attention of his readers. Stead is widely recognized as one of the leading investigative journalists of his age. Who else could claim a monument both in Central Park in New York and on the Strand in central London? He died on the Titanic, giving his place on the boat that would have rescued him and his wife to others who needed it more. Hughes seems to have been swept off his feet by this new way of presenting the news. It's hard to underestimate the strength of the relationship that was soon formed between these two men. It was the appearance of a series of 4 articles in the Gazette in July 1885 which brought Hughes and Stead together, entitled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon." Sounds interesting. They offered a graphic account of the abuses suffered by women and children, many of whom are being trafficked for sexual purposes. So graphic, in fact, that the horrific story of a 5-year-old girl who'd been raped by her purchaser led to a public outcry. Many voices were raised against Stead for making such degradation public in this way. Matthew Arnold was highly critical of what he styled this new journalism. Others, of course, rallied to the cause. For Stead, this ruthless journalistic ploy was part of his campaign to get the Criminal Justice Amendment Act, at that time being debated in Parliament, onto the statute book. This law sought to raise the age of consent for sexual acts from 13 to 18, and in the end it was settled at 16. Stead later wrote of the way he met Hughes at the time of the publication of these articles. It was a short meeting, but there was instant rapport between the two men. "We made a firm fighting alliance," Stead wrote, "not in words, but in spirit, and have fought on each on his own lines ever since." As Olston Moore concluded, Stead had spoken of the need for democracy and socialism to replace the existing power structure of the elite, whereas Hughes proclaimed the need for democracy linked with Christianity. Following the passage of the Act in August 1885, a huge rally in Hyde Park attracted over 100,000 people, and the speeches made by Hughes and Stead drew particular attention. 2 months later, the two men made a speaking tour of 11 northern cities in 12 days, addressing 31,000 people along the way. In one of his articles, in order to make his point about the way children were being trafficked, Stead purchased a 13-year-old girl, daughter of a chimney sweep, to illustrate how readily such things could happen. He was arrested and accused of procuring her and sentenced to 3 months imprisonment. It was a moment of high drama. Olston Moore wrote how, in a Methodist Times leader that attracted wide attention at the time, Hughes depicted the conflict between the judge and the jury as a drama pitting the narrow intellect and dull souls of official Britain against the sublime disinterestedness of Stead and the moral justice of the brave and honest juryman. Hughes took pride in being the last man to shake Stead's hand before he entered prison, as well as the first to greet him when he was released. And so to the Methodist Times, which saw the light of day on January the 1st, 1885. The striking resemblance to the Pall Mall Gazette, both in appearance and style, surprised no one. So I've got just a few photocopies of the front page of one of the numbers of the Methodist Times. You just pass them down whilst I'm doing this bit. So the Times became Hughes's primary means of communication until his dying day. He brought considerable journalistic experience to his new task, since from 1878 to 1883, he'd been the editor of Protest, the journal that promulgated the work of the campaign to abolish the Contagious Diseases Act. Again, an anti-women act, and Hughes's support for the cause of women is remarkable too. But this new venture took matters onto a different level. The only difference between the Gazette and the Times was the prominent display of Hughes's name on the masthead. The front page of every issue carried a leading article by Hughes. His writing style was full of the energy he displayed in his speeches. He commanded the readership as he commanded a meeting and set the tone for the entire paper. His aim was to reach young and educated Methodists, the fruits of the explosion in educational opportunity at that time. But he also had in mind the working classes with whom, for the most part, Methodism had lost touch, So he envisaged equipping the young educated to bring their influence to bear on what he described as the skilled artisans and agricultural laborers. All in all, he was envisaging a radical revival in the fortunes of his church. He promised that his paper would be a perfectly independent organ in which any intelligent and courteous writer may freely ventilate his opinions. There's going to be a bite back for that in a moment. There would be no secrecy or reticence. All important matters of controversy would be discussed, and it would be ecumenical. It became the voice of what was increasingly being called the forward movement. Another strand in the makeup of the forward movement, a direct and constant feature of the views of Hughes, was the promotion of the cause of women. His daughter, by the way, his sister, is the founder of Hughes Hall in Cambridge, named, of course, after a leading educationalist in her day. But Hughes's daughter, in her biography of her father, spells out with great clarity in her description of one of his leading articles in the Methodist Times. This is what his daughter wrote. He's very careful in the use of his pronouns to many of his contemporaries saw women quite unique. From his earliest ministry, he is most careful to include and address women not as a wearer of bonnets, but as the possessor of a soul as strenuous as his own. He became engaged in her defense and continued to be so with scarcely a break until the very end. Once the West London Mission had been established, these feelings, on behalf of women, were turned to account in a very practical way with the setting up of the Sisters of the People. Now, here's something else I wanted to go off at a tangent on, I have to say. A driving force for this was Catherine Price Hughes, his wife. He met her when she was the daughter of his college principal. She was 15. Father said he was not ruling marriage out, but they were to have no contact with each other until Hughes was in his first station. And if the both of them, having had no contact with each other, still felt the same way, he'd give his permission. Well, it all happened. It came to pass in precisely that way. And as soon as she was able, she married him. And they had about 6 children. But now freed from her childbearing years, Catherine Price, who was a very remarkable woman, saw an opportunity to use the energies of educated women who were often not allowed to enter the professions in those days, to offer care and support to anyone suffering from poverty or abuse or despair. She and her husband believed that both social and political liberation would be the work of the new sisterhood, and they explicitly intended that the Sisters of the People should offer young women independence and opportunity and advance the idea of equality for women. This was in the 1880s, right? Hughes was an upholder of the fight to extend the parliamentary franchise to women. He was delighted when 2 of the sisters became guardians of the poor, offering themselves for public office. When one of them stood for election for the St. Pancras seat, and another, described as an unconventional sister, went about with a handbell and a cart through the Cleveland Street district in which she worked, with a great placard inciting the inhabitants to plump for her as the new candidate for that ward. Some of those who served in this way went on after the death of Hughes to give their support to the suffragette movement. Hughes had, incidentally, because I don't mention it otherwise, Catherine Price, who's had a brother, he worked for the mission as well. He was a medical doctor and he specialized in care for the dying. After his death, the St. Duke's Hospital in Bayswater was set up, and the West London Mission had the rights of nomination for however many 2 or 3 members of the ruling board. And it became the founding of the hospice movement, was rooted in that very exercise. And Cicely Saunders, of course, who's associated with all of that, did her training in St. Luke's Hospital. So there's another little sort of side way thought creeping in. Hughes had enjoyed a working relationship with Josephine Butler, of course, a great 19th century campaigner for women, since the very beginning of his ministry. They'd campaigned together for the repeal of the hated Contagious Diseases Act that obliged women who were prostitutes to undergo regular tests because they were blamed for passing on diseases to the soldiers of Portsmouth and Brighton in those days, and nobody thought that perhaps the men might have had something to do with it as well. Hughes was also acquainted with Catherine Booth of the Salvation Army and admired the work of Florence Nightingale and of Mrs. Besant. He and Mrs. Butler had stood alongside W.T. Stead in the struggle to get the Criminal Justice Amendment Act onto the statute book. Stead had written and published 4 articles entitled, as I said earlier, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. He'd been pilloried for the lengths to which he'd gone to draw attention to the abuses suffered by women. Hughes was unwavering in his support for Stead and for Josephine Butler. Within the church, he campaigned hard for the admission of women to the synods and even to the annual conference. Now, here's another little thing to look at, which you may find, I find this one very interesting indeed. I thought there were 4, but there's 3. Right. In this, you can see Hugh Price Hughes with his foot in the door, opening the door of the Methodist Conference. And coming through the open door is his wife, Catherine. And trying to shut the door is Joseph Rigg, who was an opponent of having women in the Methodist Conference. But over it all, the benevolent presence of John Wesley favoring the opening of the door, which is rather a nice cartoon. It would need quite a cultural change for that to happen. Now, his critics longed for an opportunity to mount a counterattack against Hughes. It became a game of wait and see. His opponents bided their time and eventually got their opportunity to bring Hughes under close scrutiny by events which occurred in 1889, when what became known as the missionary controversy broke out. And we must turn to that now. I actually have forgotten to bring the compte rendu of the extraordinary meetings that took place to examine the case that I'm about to share with you. It's original research, folks, and even though I've forgotten to bring it, I feel obliged to mention it. So at the heart of it all was a young minister named Henry Lunn. Hughes is, and this is another man that I really want to go after. Hughes's relationship with Henry Lunn is fascinating in its own right. He was born and educated in Horncastle, Lincolnshire, in 1859, the son of devout Methodist parents. He'd qualified as a medical doctor before attending the recently opened theological college at Headingley in Leeds. He was there during a visit by Hugh Price Hughes and his wife Catherine in the early 1880s. Lunn was immediately struck by the personality of Hughes, and I quote, "Along with his fellow students, he saw in him a new order of minister, one who was keenly interested evidently in scholarly pursuits and the thought of the day, and was even so impassioned and a popular evangelist." This was a combination that had not hitherto seemed possible to the eyes of Henry Lunn, and the surprise that it provoked in him was beginning to be shared by the whole of Methodism. Lunn was fascinated by a man who was known, while still a student at college himself, to have had the courage to take a line at variance with the views of his superiors. Man after my own heart. After his ordination in 1886, Lunn undertook other studies in Trinity College, Dublin, with the intention of becoming a medical missionary. It was during that time that Gladstone published his first Home Rule Bill. Lunn and Hughes were avid supporters of this measure. Indeed, Lunn was a member of the Protestant Home Rule Association and came over to England to campaign on its behalf and that of the bill. In the months immediately preceding his departure for India, because that's what he was being trained for, Lunn began to occupy a very privileged position alongside Hughes. He became what his daughter described as the most intimate and familiar figure, the closest friend to her father. Hughes seemed captivated by this young man. They kept in touch during his time in India, and when his poor health raised the possibility of an early return, Hughes's daughter reported that it was the wish of her father's heart to have Dr. Lunn with him as a colleague at the recently launched West London mission. And that's precisely what happened. His daughter reported how, throughout this period, Lunn was constantly at my father's side of the work, father's side, helping him not only in the strictly devotional and spiritual side of the work, but as my father had expressed it in his letters, in 50 ways, in the great social and philanthropic movements which he had at heart in the Methodist Times and in his other enterprises too. But then in 1889, before he returned from India, or as he was on the point of returning from India, everything fell apart. While still in India, Lunn contributed 4 articles to his mentor's Methodist Times, which scandalized the Methodist missionary demi-monde and threatened to bring the ministries of both Lunn and Hughes to an abrupt end. These articles were considered to represent a vicious attack, not only on the culture prevailing in the Methodist mission in India, but also on the missionaries themselves. Disraeli had just made Queen Victoria Empress of India, which was henceforth ruled on her behalf by a viceroy. Lunn seemed to suggest that the missionaries responded to these developments by adopting an exaggerated lifestyle, which kept them in touch with the court on the one hand and with the Brahmin rulers on the other. They imagined fondly that by educating the Brahmins, their teaching would be passed on by the Brahmins to other classes of Indian society. A bungalow and a phaeton were provided. Pay was much better than elsewhere. There were servants to help them along and great cultural events to attend. Well, these articles not only brought all this to light, but also suggested the best way to make economies. It might have been Rachel Reed proposing tax cuts and so cutting wages. The overall idea behind these pieces purported to be the need to bring the missionaries much closer to the natives, not the Brahmins. As things stood, the allegation went, it was far too elitist. Now, the uproar, this was the jewel in Methodism's overseas mission's crown, the Indian mission. The uproar caused by these articles led critics to insist on an inquiry. They wanted blood. A committee was put together to examine the case. Leaders from the Indian mission were brought back to London to answer and rebut the charges laid against them. It was useless for Hughes to argue that the articles were focused on policy rather than individuals, nor that his freedom of press policy of allowing his newspaper to ventilate views about the questions of the day, even when they provoked disagreement, was either appropriate or necessary. The Committee of Inquiry spent 4 10-hour days investigating the issues. Their findings were published in a 383-page book. You have to take my word for that. That's the one I forgot to bring. No quarter was spared. One of the missionaries, brought from India, the Reverend George Patterson, spoke scathingly as follows. You get the flavor of it. If the Methodist Times is to be believed, the missionary in India is a despicable fraud, drawing money for work he does not do, occupying a position calculated to draw down upon him the contempt of every honest man, and false alike to himself, to his employers, and to his God. It seems to us that the Methodist Times has allowed itself to be made the medium of private spite. For it's almost impossible that an honest man with an honest desire to render aid in a difficult problem could frame in cold blood an incident such as this. We know very little about the Methodist Times, except that it's always had the reputation of being a well-conducted journal. But it certainly has a higher mission than stabbing its friends in their back under pretense of helping them out of the mire. Well, now, that's kind of makes its point, doesn't it? Another speaker, the Reverend Joseph Posnet, launched an even more personal tirade. He felt the moral character of the missionaries had been put in doubt, and he wanted Hughes to do something about it. Here we go. They must have that matter put right, he said, for nothing could be settled until it was settled. Mr. Hughes had as great a heart as any of them touching the character of those men. He believed that Mr. Hughes wished that those articles had never been written. He was as magnificent a man as there was in this room, but sometimes it was good for a big-hearted man like Mr. Hughes to make a good, large-hearted confession. He, Mr. Posnet, believed that he had not been large-hearted enough in his penitence. He could not understand how it was that he had not somehow or other expressed a deeper penitential spirit. And so it ran and ran. For days, Hughes and Lunn did their best, but as things reached their conclusion, there seemed a real likelihood that both men faced ejection from their ministries. A man who could write like that, and an editor who could take it in, are certainly men to be looked at, said one member of the committee. But at the end, it all resulted in a simple resolution that this committee expresses its great satisfaction that its missionaries in India have been completely exonerated and records its profound regret that charges so grave and so unsustained should ever have been brought against them. The result of the vote was that, with one exception, everybody voted in favor of it. Now, this was a severe blow to Hughes and Lunn. Both had faced ejection from their ministries. Indeed, Hughes had written a letter of resignation and begun discussions with the Presbyterian Church to enter its ranks. Lunn was offered a position as chaplain of the London Polytechnic. Emotions ran wild. Some people were angry because of the nature of the crisis. Others took some pleasure from the setback suffered by the leader of the so-called forward movement. Barely hidden from view were the, my inverted commas, tectonic plates, which had moved so disastrously during the flysheet controversies 40 years previously, with those wanting the autocratic style against the democratic style, still harboring grudges against each other. Hughes never understood the intensity of the bitterness that he had aroused in a significant body of people in the conference, or how he'd stirred a sleeping beast to life. Hughes's family were in no doubt that he'd made a ghastly error. His daughter wrote that, in her words, in his passionate desire to help to bring about what he considered at that time necessary reform in foreign missionary policy, he did not sufficiently consider the how and the when and the where of introducing it. So it was a blunder, a miscalculation, a strategic error, and in those circumstances, it must have been a great relief to everyone when a way was found to continue Hughes in his post after all, and also to allow Lunn to serve the Polytechnic. Now, I have just to pause here because Lunn served the Polytechnic for a while, but then resigned his Methodist minister's status. By then, he discovered Switzerland and had, well, we'll come to that in a moment, but he went on to promote Switzerland as a holiday resort for British people. And he is, of course, the founder of the Lunn Poly Travel Agency. So another little sort of interesting way to explore. And, you know, he got the poly even from the Polytechnic, you see, so it's very interesting, isn't it? It's astonishing that at the very time this major crisis, and it was major, was being acted out, Hughes, far from being weighed down, incapacitated, keeping a low profile, was hyperactive on two other fronts. They're interrelated, but need to be addressed separately at this point. Now, my Irish friend here is going to correct me if I got any of this wrong. The first of these is centred on the person of Charles Parnell, leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party and close collaborator with Gladstone in his efforts to get a Home Rule Bill passed in the British Parliament in 1890. Parnell had shown outstanding commitment to the plight of Irish tenants. As W.B. Yeats put it, he fought the might of England and saved the Irish poor. Whatever good a farmer's got, he brought it all to pass. He's been widely recognised as the founder of the first organised party in the British Parliament. A clandestine, adulterous relationship with a woman named Kitty O'Shea had hung menacingly over the cause he espoused for a decade. It eventually flared into life in late 1890. Both Hughes and Lunn had long been in favour of Home Rule. Hughes was making huge strides to bring the nonconformist churches together into one bloc, an initiative that would eventually become the Free Church Federal Council. He was its first president. The support of this group of churches would materially help the government get their bill onto the statute book. Hughes, his voice suitably amplified through his editorship of the Methodist Times, had the ear of leading people both inside the church and beyond it. The divorce between Kitty O'Shea and her husband was finalized in November 1890, and Parnell was cited as co-respondent. This occasioned a huge crisis. The Catholic bishops distanced themselves from Parnell and refused him a church wedding, although he was an Anglican, it should be said. He and O'Shea married in May 1891. Hughes was adamant that these developments made it impossible for him or the free churches to continue their support of him, Parnell. He coined the memorable phrase that whatever is morally wrong can never be politically right. Try applying that now. He was outspoken in his opposition to the Parnell cause. He didn't hold back. And here he is in the Methodist Times. We've made many sacrifices for Home Rule. We've sacrificed hundreds of subscribers, especially in Ireland, and wounded some whose sympathy and support we desired on the highest ground to retain, because we have advocated the cause of Home Rule. We mention it only to vindicate our right to speak as friends of the Irish people. And we do not hesitate to say that if the Irish race deliberately select as their recognised representative an adulterer of Mr. Parnell's type, they are as incapable of self-government as their bitterest enemies have asserted. Well, he and his friend W.T. Stead, who produced similar stuff in the Review of Reviews, which he now edited, were denounced as pseudo-fanatics, a charge which Hughes rebutted strongly, but the die was cast. The free churches were united in their condemnation of Parnell's adultery. Hughes did make an effort to counter those who criticized his more colourful outburst by writing, "I have stood on this very platform at Mr. Parnell's side, rejoicing in the vindication of his character from the infamous charge of Piggott the forger." It was a case where Parnell was accused of planning and plotting the what was the name of the man now? The British representatives in Dublin, and it turned out that the letters that he was purported to have written were forged by a man called Piggott. And if he'd been able to vindicate it now, we should have rejoiced more than we did then. Further, if he'd retired quietly and promptly from public life, we would have spread the mantle of silence over him and not uttered a word to add to his humiliation. But Gladstone was obliged to recognize the impossibility of continuing to work with Parnell. The Home Rule project was dropped, and Parnell himself died a disillusioned man a few months later. Hughes and his supporters were obliged to suffer the criticisms that came their way: treacherous, misguided, reactionary, anti-Irish, reckless. One critic faulted Hughes in particular for having injected into the controversy a note of hysterical fanaticism. The crisis gave birth to the phrase, the nonconformist conscience. But a former private secretary of Gladstone concluded that however narrow-minded and illiberal people may be, it's impossible to disregard the puritanical frenzy of the nonconformists, who formed so important a factor in the Liberal Party. I have to say that there was a real thought around at the time that the free churches as a bloc could pull more weight with Gladstone and public opinion than the Church of England could. Whilst all this was going on, and I'm getting to the end now, you'll be relieved to hear. Whilst all this was going on, Hughes was working fiendishly with leaders of the Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians to forge a kind of federated unity. With Lund's help through the years 1892 to 1895, he took these efforts even further with a series of ecumenical conferences held in Switzerland, in Grindelwald and Lucerne, which included senior Anglicans, including bishops. But efforts to forge wider unity were thwarted by the High Church party in the Church of England, who clung to the historic episcopate and the Lambeth quadrilateral as the sine qua non for any such moves, as they still do. For all that, however, communities previously known as nonconformists were henceforth to be styled free churches, and Hughes was undoubtedly the major force behind that. He was the first elected president of the Free Church Congress in 1895 and the reconstituted Evangelical Free Churches a year later. And all this was capped by his presidency of the Methodist Conference in 1898. The departure of Gladstone from the political scene and the fall of his successor's government in 1895, and that was Rosebery. Interestingly, Rosebery, his horse won the Derby. And winning the Derby was on a par with having an adulterous relationship. So you couldn't support Rosebery either. So it was a serious setback for Hughes and his collaborators. The agendas to which they devoted so much energy, non-sectarian education, temperance, purity, home rule, and the governance of London, all began to lose their energy. And so too did Hughes, whose illness in 1895 was a precursor to more extended periods of ill health that were to beset him for the rest of his life. He died of a stroke in 1902, was buried in Highgate Cemetery, where Karl Marx had been laid to rest just a few years earlier. Christopher Olston Moore quoted David Lloyd George, present at the funeral of Hughes in Wesley's Chapel, who remarked, "There lies silent the greatest spiritual force my race has produced for a generation." 13 years later, in the middle of the First World War, and by then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George unveiled a portrait to Hughes, the one that was behind me in my office. It had been painted in honor of, and I quote, to honor a great man, a great free churchman, a great Welshman, a man who had shaped the political conscience of British nonconformists, but who, according to Lloyd George, was not a true heir to the great Welsh preachers. He had not their accent, their hoil. His Welsh heritage was not to be found in his style or manner, but in his spirit. Lloyd George explained in reference to Carmarthen, and with this I end. The town in which Hugh Price Hughes was born was not surrounded by scenery characteristic of Wales, nor of Hughes. It was a quiet, slumberous place, with a slow stream gliding around the hillside. But at first, that stream had been full of energy, life, determination, and as it ran between its rocks and over its pebbles, its waters had been clear and pure. Hughes was the mountain stream, whose waters were clear as the water of life. This is David Lloyd George at his quintessential best. He was a great man who came at the right moment to give new life to the Methodist movement. Or, as the poet Byron put it, the sword outwears the sheath, and the soul wears out the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself must rest. There.